going to be about how to fondant cover a cake. It seems like it would be easier than it actually is, but there's a few tricks to it that I want to share with you in this video. As you can see from some of the cakes that I've made in the past, a fondant base is a really nice, neat and professional looking start point for any of your decorated cakes. There's a bit more to it than slapping on some frosting and chucking on your fondant. So in this video, I'm going to cover off some different fondants that I like to use, when you should use homemade versus store-bought, how to create a really beautiful, solid base cake before you even cover it in fondant to ensure the best results, and the types of cakes that I like to use for my fondant covered cakes. I'm going to put this video in a playlist which includes your fondant recipes, fondant frequently asked questions, tips and tricks on how to cover fondant, as well as my frozen stacked fondant cake, which also includes some fake layers and how to cover fake layers and when you would use fake cake layers in a regular cake. All of the recipes, tips, tricks, and all of those videos compiled in the one place can be found on the MyCupcakeAddiction website, and I will link to that post down below for everything you need to know about fondant. The type of cake and frosting that you use for a fondant decorated cake is quite specific, so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this. I would always use a mud cake rather than a sponge or a pound cake or any other sort of cake. I always use a mud because they've got about a week shelf life from the time you bake them, which gives you plenty of time to decorate them and plenty of time to get them to your guests before they're actually supposed to be eaten. I also would never use a buttercream frosting in between my mud cake layers. I always use a chocolate ganache. The reason for this is because the chocolate in the ganache sets quite firm, which gives you a really nice, neat base, and it avoids any bulging between your cake layers when you put that fondant on. Fondant's pretty heavy after all. Ganache has also got a great shelf life, so that's also going to last you a week from the time you make it at room temperature. So these cakes, you don't want to refrigerate them, they don't need to be refrigerated. For each cake layer you use, you're going to need a cake board. I always use the Masonite wooden cake boards because they're really nice and firm, but if you can get the thicker cardboard or the thicker lightweight cake boards, they're great too. You want one cake board the same size as each of your cake layers. So if that's going to be a 6-inch, an 8-inch, a 10-inch and a 12-inch, you want to make sure you've got those corresponding size cake boards. You'll need some kind of a scraper, and a metal ruler also works here if you can't find a professional level cake scraper, but just something that you can use to smooth off your edges, a serrated edge knife and an offset spatula. And of course you'll also need your fondant. Now fondant's one of those things, if I'm covering smaller cakes or making small fondant decorations for cupcakes and things like that, I'll always use homemade because it just tastes so much better. It tastes like marshmallows and it's delicious. But if I'm covering layers of cake bigger than about 10 inches, then I'd always use store-bought fondant. It doesn't taste as good. It's still delicious, don't get me wrong, but it doesn't taste quite as nice as the homemade. But it's a lot more stretchy, a lot more durable, and it doesn't dry out as quickly, so it's a lot more forgiving as your cakes get larger. I would also always use store-bought for a square cake because square cakes are a lot harder to cover in fondant than rounds. Keep that in mind if you've got a choice in the shape of cake you're gonna do. Once you've got your mud cakes baked, you want to let them cool completely in their tins because they'll come out a lot easier, and then you want to cut off any crispy edges, and this is more just for the mouthfeel as people are actually eating the cake. It's kind of weird if you're eating through a piece of cake and you find these little crunchy bits from around the edges. You can use a cake leveler here, but I always just cut mine by eye, and I'll always cut mine into 3 layers. Don't worry if they're not perfectly even or perfectly neat because it's all going to come together as a really nice, neat round cake when we're done. I always use a cake turntable, and you'll see I've got a little bit of like non-slip matting or drawer lining. That's to stop all of my boards from sliding around. And I always have a larger cake board down first, a bit more non-slip matting, and then the cake board that's the same size as my cake layer, because that allows me to make sure that I've got a board that can get really messy and a nice flat surface when I'm doing all of my leveling. Your easiest ganaches to work with, starting with dark chocolate, then milk, with white chocolate being the hardest. I've let this ganache set at room temperature for about 3 hours, so it's not fully set, but you can see it's also not still liquid. Put a smear of it down onto the cake board, which is going to glue our first layer of cake in place. And depending on when you're going to serve this cake, mine's being served in the next 2 days, so I'm not going to worry about a syrup coat, but you would brush this layer of cake with some syrup prior to putting the ganache on it if you know that you're making the cake on a Monday and it's not going to be eaten till like a Saturday. It just gives it a little bit more moisture. A really thin coat of ganache goes down in between the 2 layers, and don't go crazy with the thickness of this ganache because you're going to have ganache in between the layers, ganache around the outside, ganache around the cake, and it's a mud cake which is rich already. Traditionally, fondant covered cakes are not designed to be served in massive slices though. Did you know the traditional wedding cake size is a finger serve, and it's like 1 centimeter by 1 centimeter. That's what they expect people are going to eat. I don't know about you, but I have never limited myself to a 1 centimeter square piece of cake at a wedding. It's the best part. So once you've got ganache on all of your layers and a little bit smeared on top, you want to just make sure that your layers stay nice and even. So shove them around a bit if you have to, and put a really light coat all the way around the edges. Cover it as best as you can and make sure that you've got no little gaps or holes, and then pop that off into the freezer for about 15-20 minutes just to let that first coat of ganache set and get nice and firm. Once it comes out from the freezer, you're going to put a ton of ganache on the sides. This is going to feel like a lot. It is a lot, but we're going to scrape a lot of it back, so don't stress. Once you've got a heap of ganache on the sides of your cake, you can build up the top a little bit and then take your scraper and you want to scrape back around the edges. Your scraper should be coming up right against that cake board, which means that your cake should be in line perfectly straight and smooth with that cake board, and your side walls should be perfect, straight and smooth. When you're relatively happy with the side walls, use your offset spatula just to sort of drag that ganache into the center of the cake and make the top of the cake as neat and as flat as possible. What you're achieving here is a really nice smooth base, and you'll probably scrape around the edges a couple more times and the top to get it perfect. Don't worry if you've got these little ridges around the top. I'm going to show you how to get those off. Pop that back off into the freezer for 15 minutes and just let that coat of ganache set, but you don't want to completely freeze the cake at this point. With your ganache set, you want to soak your offset spatula in some boiling water for a few minutes so it gets really nice and hot. And you can see here, I'm using it almost like a bit of a knife just to scrape off any of those little raised edges, and you should end up with a pretty nice sharp edge on the side of your cake. Do not agonize over the sharpness of your edges. Do not agonize over making these cakes perfect. This is how you get a great base to the cake, but unless you're a professional cake decorator charging thousands of dollars for your creations, this will give you a perfectly acceptable base that's really nice and firm, great for stacking, and it's gonna look gorgeous. When you're happy with your edges, you want to brush your entire cake with some simple syrup, and mine is really simple. Take a tablespoon of apricot jam and about 3 tablespoons of tap water, chuck it in the microwave for about 30 seconds till it all comes together, and brush it onto the cake. Sprinkle down a generous amount of corn flour so your fondant doesn't stick to the bench, and you want to roll that out to about 2 millimeters or the thickness of about 3 credit cards. I always use my rolling pin as a good measure as to how big my fondant is compared to how big the cake is. So if I know that fondant's about the length of the bulk part of my rolling pin, then when I hold the rolling pin up against the cake, I can look at that and say, yep, I've got enough fondant to cover this particular sized cake. Saves you getting out any rulers or measures. To pick up your fondant, slide your hands and also parts of your arms underneath it so you can keep it as flat as possible, and then just drape it over the top of the center of the cake. Using your hand and working quite quickly, you want to smooth out the top and work any air bubbles that you can feel out the edges. Secure the top inch of the sides because that's the most important part, so it's not going to tear down and make any little rips. And then you want to pull out the outer edges or your skirt of fondant before using the palms of your hands to smooth down those side walls one section at a time. Pulling out the skirt stops you from getting any wrinkles in the sides. Once you're happy your sides are all stuck, you want to push that bottom skirt of fondant right firm up into the cake board and then trim around the outside edge with a pizza cutter. You can pull away that excess fondant, but just check the bottom of it for any bits that have got ganache or water and pick those off before you store the rest of that fondant for the next time you need to use it. If you happen to notice any of these little air bubbles in the tops or sides of your cake, you just want to pop them using just a little pin and push them back together so that you've got no air trapped underneath the sides of your cake. I don't know how true this is, but I have heard that that air can expand and literally blow out the side of your cake, and we don't want that. For your really smooth finish, this tool is a bit unique. It's actually called a cake smoother, and it's basically a piece of Perspex with a little handle on it. You could also use something like a piece of acetate or even a cutout section of an old x-ray to get a really nice smooth finish on the fondant. And you can see with my hand on the top of the cake, I'm actually pushing the top fondant into the cake smoother, which is helping to give me a nice sharp edge on the edges of the cake. So that's it. Your fondant cake is now ready to stack, to decorate, whatever you like. I always find fondant covered cakes a touch easier to decorate if I leave them for about 12 hours after covering them, because the ganache has time to set and the fondant will start to set a little bit as well. If you love this video, make sure you give it a like or a share. Subscribe to My Cupcake Addiction if you're not already for 2 new videos every week. And as always, guys, thanks very much for tuning in to My Cupcake Addiction.